Right, in class we've been talking about quadratic equations. Right, this video is about comparing the different methods that we have to solve them. All right, so let's first make sure we define some terms. Right, what's a quadratic equation? Right, a quadratic equation means that the highest power is x squared. You're not going to have x cubed or x to the fourth. Right, you need to have an x squared as the highest power, or in other words, it's degree 2. And specifically in this video, we're going to be looking at quadratic equations that are trinomials. In other words, they are going to be in this format: ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Right, so for example, it could be something like this: 3x squared minus 4x plus 5 equals 0. Or it could be negative 2x squared plus 10x minus 8 equals 0. So something like this, right? So in this first equation here, it's quadratic because we have x squared, and then 3, that's the a value, negative 4, that's the b value, 5, that's the c value. In this one, negative 2 is the a value, positive 10 is the b value, and negative 8 is the c value. Right? So we're going to be working with these types of quadratic equations. And so far we've talked about two different methods of solving them: factoring and completing the square. Right? So the purpose of this video is for you to understand when is it a good idea to factor and when is it a good idea to complete the square. Alright, let's look at this first example. Right, x squared plus 10x minus 3 equals 0. And you might say, oh, let's try to do magic x. Let's try to factor. So if we were to do magic x, we'd have 10x on the bottom, and we'd have negative 3x squared on the top. Okay, and you'd try to find two numbers that multiply to get negative 3x squared and add up to be 10x. And the answer here is this does not work. You cannot find two numbers that multiply to get negative 3x squared and add up to be 10x. Okay, so this doesn't work. Right? And that's actually why we have a method like completing the square, is because magic x doesn't always work. Okay? And so this one, we can do completing the square. All right? And let's try to do that real fast. So first step, we would add 3 to both sides. And then we have x squared plus 10x equals 3. And now we have to add our special number. Right? Remember our special number? To find that, we take this b value, 10, divided by 2, you get 5, square that, and we get 25. So now we have 28 on the left, and the left-hand side is a perfect square trinomial. Right? So this is x plus 5 times x plus 5, or in other words, x plus 5 squared. Okay? And then next, we're going to take the square root of both sides, which gives us the absolute value of x plus 5 equals this. I'm going to go ahead and just tell you, this simplifies to be 2 radical 7. All right, which implies that x plus 5 could either be equal to 2 radical 7, or x plus 5 will be equal to negative 2 radical 7. Okay, I'm going to skip to the end. At the very end, you discovered that x could either be equal to negative 5 plus 2 radical 7, or x could be equal to negative 5 minus 2 radical 7. Right? So that's completing the square. Okay, now the purpose of this video, again, is not really to teach you completing the square. That was the previous video. Right? So you should already know how to do this. Right? Rather, what I want to talk about is why is completing the square a good method for here? Right? Well, first we talked about how magic x didn't work. Right? So factoring didn't work. But why was completing the square a good idea here? Right? There's two reasons. First is that your b value was even. Right? Why is that important? Right? This is our b value, 10. Why is it important that that was even? Well, because to find this number, we had to take 10, divide that by 2 to get 5, and you square that and you get 25. Right? And that works easiest when this number is even. It's still possible to do if it's odd, but it's just harder. right? And so, I mean, if this number, let's pretend that instead of a 10, that was a 9, right? Well, if that was 9, we'd have to take 9, divide that by 2, you get 4.5 or 9 halves, and then you have to square that to get this, and it just gets kind of ugly. It's still possible to do that, but it's just not as easy. Okay, so completing the square works the best when your b value is even. Completing the square also works well when your a value is equal to 1. Right? So right here we had an a value of 1. Right? And why is that important? Because right here, this was a perfect square trinomial. Right? And this type of perfect square trinomial, in order for this to factor to be like this, we need our a value to be 1. Okay? So these are the two things that I really need you to remember. In order for completing the square to work well, you want your b value to be even, and you want an a value of 1. Let's take a look at this second one. All right? And let's think about, would completing the square work? Right? Well, I see that a is equal to 1 here, so that's good. But the other thing I see is that b is odd here. We got a 5 here. So completing the square wouldn't work. So on this one, I would not complete the square. Right? Well, let's see. Would magic x work? We have 5x on the bottom and negative 24x squared on top. And let's see, can we figure out numbers that work here? The answer is yes. It would be 8x and negative 3x. Right? So if you can get a magic x to work, then you should do it. You should factor it. Okay? We're not actually going to solve this problem, right? But I just want to show you that this kind of problem would work well with factoring. How do we know? Because we tried the magic x and it worked. So this one would work well with factoring, right? It doesn't work with completing the square because the b value is odd. Let's take a look at this one, right? So imagine this is your homework and you're asked to solve this. Well, how do you decide what method to use, right? Like, again, let's kind of go through those methods. Well, I would always kind of try magic x first. Does magic x work here? Negative 8x on the bottom, 6x squared on the top. Okay, but can we figure out numbers that work here? The answer is no. So this one, I would not factor. Okay, so factoring doesn't work. How about completing the square? Would completing the square work? Right, well, I see that b is even, so that's good. Oh, but wait a minute. A is not equal to 1. A is equal to 3. So on this one, this is actually an example where factoring is not a good idea, and also completing the square is not a good idea either. Okay, and I just want to point that out, right? We have learned two methods so far. Right? Factoring works when the magic x works. Completing the square works when b is even and when the a value is 1. This one doesn't work for either of those cases. And in the future, we're going to learn a third method. Okay, so quick summary. Right? So when we have an equation like this, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Right? Factoring, you should use factoring. You're going to use if the magic x works. Okay? For completing the square, use this if the a value is equal to 1 and if your b value is even. Okay, so these are the primary methods that we've learned so far. Factoring, use it if your magic x works. Completing the square, use that if a is equal to 1 and b is equal to an even number. Okay, and then kind of like I was saying, eventually we're going to learn a third method. Not in this video, but in the future we're going to learn a third method that we would use when this doesn't work and when this doesn't work. All right, last thing I would like you to do. I would like you to think about these four equations and think about which method would work the best. You don't actually have to solve the equation. I just want you to figure out if factoring or completing the square would work the best. So please pause this video at this point and write down whether you would factor or if you would complete the square. Okay, pause and do that. All right, welcome back. Let's see if you got these right. Okay, number 4, this one I would complete. I'm going to abbreviate. Complete the square. All right, why? It's because you have an a value of 1 and you have a b value of -6, which is even. Right? And also, if you tried to do magic X with this, you could try magic X. It doesn't work. Okay? Number 5, this one I would factor. Right? If you try magic X with this, right, 5x on the bottom, -14x squared on the top. If you try magic X on that one, you can figure out the two numbers that work here. So factoring works. Also, completing the square isn't a good idea because even though you have a 1 here, this b value here is odd. So that one I would do by factoring. Number 6, this one also works by factoring. Right? Again, I'm not going to do the whole thing, but if you set up your magic X, -30x squared here, you can find two numbers that work here, right? It's going to be 6x and -5x. So this one works by factoring. The reason why completing the square isn't such a good idea is because right here you don't have a 1 there. You have an a value of 2. All right, last two. These ones are kind of interesting. All right, number 7. This one, if you do magic X, it works. So you could factor. Would completing the square work? The answer is yes, because you have an a value of 1 and because you have a b value that's even. So for number 7, you could actually factor or you could complete the square. Last one. This one does not work with either of them. So I'm going to write down neither. If you try magic X here, it doesn't work. This one doesn't work with completing the square because even though you have an even number here, this number here is not 1. Okay? So in class, we're going to practice more of this, right? Deciding when is it good to complete the square, when is it good to factor.